Welcome back to Inside Kansas Politics. We're back now with the first candidate to announce their run for Kansas Secretary of State.
It's a story we first broke on 27 News. I sat down with Kansas House Elections Chair Pat Proctor for his first exclusive interview to talk about his top priorities and why he says the January 6th riot in D.C. is one of the reasons he's running. Okay, so Representative Proctor, I wanted to start by asking, why are you running?
When I first came to the legislature, they put me on the elections committee, and I was like, why'd they put me on the elections committee? So I went to the Secretary of State's office, and I spent the whole day with the elections team there, and they just kind of filled my head with everything from A to Z about elections. And the whole time I was in there, my phone was blowing up, and I'm like, I'm obviously not going to be rude. They're taking their time for me, so I didn't check my phone. When I walked out of the Secretary of State's office, I looked down at my phone, and the day I was there was January 6, 2021. And everything that had happened in January 26 was in my phone. And it really just impressed upon me how vital to our form of government and our way of life that not only that our elections are secure, but that people know they're secure, that voters have the confidence that the results of the election reflect their will. And I really became passionate about it, so passionate about it that I became the elections chair. And now I really think that it's very, very important that we have somebody in the seat in the Secretary of State's office that is focused on building up voter confidence and restoring confidence in the process rather than tearing it down. And so that's why I've decided to run for Secretary of State.
Okay. And with January 6th, so you think that those people that were, storming the Capitol in D.C., it was because of their frustration?
No, I mean, whatever you think about January 6th, I know that opinions vary widely. I think we can all agree that those folks believe that the election in 2020 was stolen. And, I think it's just a great illustration of what our whole country could look like if we lose voter confidence. A few years ago, not many years ago, Hayes State University did a poll, found nearly half of Kansans no longer believe that the results of our election reflect the will of the voters. I served in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen what it looks like when people lose faith in democracy and start picking up guns to settle their problems instead of going to the ballot box. And I will do everything in my power to stop that from happening here in Kansas and in America.
Do you think they were right then to do that?
I can't speak to the entire country, but our elections here in Kansas are secure, and they were secure in 2020. But again, if people don't believe they're secure, it doesn't matter how secure they are. So it's not just about the technology and the methods that we use to secure our election. It's about being transparent, so that people know that our elections are secure. And where there are vulnerabilities, because elections are run by humans and there are going to be things that need to be fixed, where there are vulnerabilities, we address them in a way that keeps it easy to vote but assures everybody that it's hard to cheat.
Now, what's your perspective on voting in elections? You gave me a little bit of insight there, but I've heard that no early voting is something that you've been for, and no 3-day grace period. Right?
So those are two separate things. There was a video that was purported to be a leaked video that of a secret meeting of legislators. In fact, it was a town hall run by the majority leader that I was invited to be the guest speaker of. And what I said in that town hall, I stand by. In a perfect world, everybody would vote on Election Day. In a perfect world, the only people who would mail in vote are the people that couldn't get to the polls. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live, people like the convenience. I vote early because on Election Day, I'm sort of busy. So, people like that convenience, so we need to focus on how we can make it as secure as possible to vote on Election Day or vote early or vote by mail.
I think in the video as well, you mentioned that with having that 3-day grace period, it was disenfranchising rural voters.
Well, it's not, right. So I thought it was, at the time we didn't have the data, and I thought it was just disenfranchising rural voters. But what we heard from the Secretary of State, and I think he was on the show talking about it back in September or October, when they got the data from the election officers across the state of the primary election, 1,000 voters their votes were not counted because they showed up during that 3-day grace period. The voter did everything right, the election officer did everything right, but the post office didn't put a little postmark on the ballot. And the law is we have to know that your ballot was cast before election night, the end of election night. And so those ballots couldn't be counted. 1,000 voters, that's 2% of all the mail-in votes cast in the primary were not counted because they showed up during the 3-day grace period without a postmark. 32 other states have already solved this problem by just making election night. They stopped taking ballots on election night, and I think we should join the nearly 2/3 of the country that do it that way.
Okay. So with that particular thought, do you think the fault was then on the post office, or was it on the mail-in ballots?
Yeah. Well, there's, ideally, if, we could fix the post office, which federal government's been trying to do for quite some time, we would just have them postmark every ballot. But there's nothing requiring them to postmark those ballots. Postmarking is for canceling a stamp. And if a ballot doesn't have a stamp, because a lot of counties don't put a stamp on their ballot, then they don't postmark the ballot. And you can ask, and I know Secretary of State Schwab did a ton of work with the Postmaster General, and they stepped up their game, and they did a little bit better in the general election than they had done in the primary when they disenfranchised 2% of mail-in voters. But I think it's simpler if we just eliminate the 3-day grace period, like 32 other states have already done, make election night the night that we stop taking ballots, and then you don't have to have a postmark, because unless somebody mailed it through a time machine, it was clearly cast before election night.
But your perspective is that election day should be election day.
Well, like I said, in a perfect world, where everybody could vote on election day, I think that, in a perfect world, we'd all vote on election day. But that's not, we don't live in that world, right? Police, fire, there are tons of people that can't vote on election day, that we can't, even if we made a national holiday, there'd be some people that had to work that day. And so early voting is not going anywhere, mail-in voting is not going anywhere. I'm not trying to eliminate either, and we need to focus on making those as secure as we can.
We'll be back with more from that interview after the break.
You're watching Inside Kansas Politics. Welcome back to Inside Kansas Politics. We have more from that exclusive interview with the new Secretary of State candidate, Pat Proctor.
And he says that boosting election integrity is a top priority.
Some of the duties of the Secretary of State include they're being responsible for administering elections, but also collecting certain records of Kansas businesses, publishing official publications for the state of Kansas. So you're potentially maintaining hundreds of thousands of documents at a time. Why should Kansans trust you in that position?
Well, that's a great question. So a big role of the Secretary of State's office is the role that it does in fostering business, right? Because when an entrepreneur wants to start a business, their first stop is to go to the Secretary of State's office and file for a incorporation or an LLC or whatever. And I'm a small business owner. Me and my wife own a couple restaurants, one in Leavenworth and one in Manhattan. And I know what it's like to be starting a business. We started out in 2006. We had no clue what we were doing. We knew we wanted to have restaurants. And so we had to navigate that Byzantine process. And what I'd like to do is really transform that platform in the Secretary of State's office into an engine for growing the Kansas economy. I would like it to be a one-stop shop. Yes, you go to the Secretary of State's website to file for your corporation, but all the other resources that you need, from the Department of Ag, if you're going to, start a restaurant, you need to file with the health department or whatever. All the things that you need are there, a click away. So it's kind of the center where a person goes when they want to start a business to find out all the things that they have to do at the federal, at the state, and at the local level. So yeah, I think that that's an important part of what the Secretary of State does. Everybody wants to talk about elections, but I think that's important too.
Okay. Would you say you're a more moderate or conservative candidate? And I ask this because I think partisanship has played a big role in some of these elections, or in this position particularly in the past few years, mainly when backing what some have called election conspiracies or thoughts of election fraud or anything like that. So do you believe in any of these conspiracies, quote unquote, and where would you say you lean politically?
Well, I'm a conservative Republican, and I'm the first Republican reelected in my district since 1994, and I just did the three-peat, even though I'm much more conservative than my district. But I level with folks. When I'm going door to door talking to every voter, I tell them this is where I stand on the issues, and I think people appreciate that. So I don't believe every theory that's out there about what's gone on with our elections, But something that's interesting is they all start from a nugget of truth, a vulnerability in our election system, and then sometimes they kind of fill in the facts they don't know with conjecture. And so I think that there's a role for addressing the vulnerabilities in the election system. Again, where it doesn't make it harder to vote, but it assures people that we're making it harder to cheat. Drop boxes is a perfect example, right? There was a video out there called 2,000 Mules about how people were using the drop boxes in some state to steal the election. And, Dinesh D'Souza, who was the narrator to that, has since come out and said, I was sort of misinformed, and a lot of the stuff I said in that video weren't true. But at the nugget of that is the concern about the drop boxes. And we have an issue with drop boxes in our state. There are no regulations for drop boxes. Every county sort of does what it wants to do. I've been working with the Secretary of State to try to get a bill passed that would give him the authority to regulate drop boxes, and I hope we're going to get that done. And then, when it's time to work on that, we should work with the election officers, because every county is different. Every county is, got its own unique challenges, and so we need to make sure we craft the regulations in a way that is voter friendly, because at the end of the day, the job of the Secretary of State and the job of all those election officers is to facilitate voters being able to vote in a simple way. And so I wouldn't say I'm like pro conspiracy theory, I'd say I'm pro voter and pro election officer. And so I'm going to be working with those things in mind, just like I've worked for the last 3 years as the chair of the Elections Committee.
So you're open to hearing other perspectives and admitting or acknowledging when your perspective could change based on what you hear.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't do this. I don't do this professionally. Run elections, right? I'm the chair of the Elections Committee, and we oversee election law. But I don't every day take ballots and print ballots and count ballots. So I do everything in my power to get out to as many election officers as I can. I've been, I haven't been to all of them yet, but I was just out in Hayes the other day talking to their election officer. I've been in Butler County, Bunsey County, and then I've been to all the big counties, Sedgwick and Wyandotte and Johnson County, talking to the election officers. And because everybody's situation is so unique, and as we're talking about election law, we need to make sure that we're keeping all those things in account, because I want to make it easier on the election officers, not harder.
Okay, campaign slogan?
I am focused on getting things done, just like I've been focused on getting things done in the legislature. But if I have to have a tagline, I'd just say restore confidence in the process.